My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island, brought to you by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature, the Taiwan Wenshui-guan. Today's podcast is on Lai He, at least that's how his name is pronounced in Mandarin. In Taiwanese, it's Lao He. Sorry, my Taiwanese is just not that good. I only speak a little bit of Taiwanese. Because my Taiwanese is so terrible, I'm going to stick to the Mandarin pronunciation of his name. Before we jump into a discussion of Lai He and his works, let's place Lai He in a context, situating him as to where he is in Taiwan literature. There were some writers of poetry in Taiwan before Lai He. In the history podcast, we talked about Qiu Fengjia, a poet who was fairly famous in Taiwan in 1895 when Taiwan was ceded by Qing China to Meiji Japan. That said, Taiwan had a very limited number of literary figures before the 1920s. The reason for this is clear when you look at the history of Taiwan. For several centuries, Taiwan was an island whose indigenous population had very small-scale social organizations. There was no writing amongst the indigenous people until the Dutch arrived on the island in the early part of the 17th century and created a script for some of the languages indigenous to Taiwan. That was also the time that the Han Chinese came from China to Taiwan to colonize the island, starting first with the help of the Dutch and then with the help of the Qing Empire. The Han Chinese colonized the island and soon outnumbered indigenous folks. But for a century or so after the Qing conquest of the island in 1683, Taiwan was a frontier island. In one podcast, I compared it to the Wild Wild West. That's a good way to think about it. There's very little in terms of artistic production happening in Taiwan in this frontier society. The kinds of men, and they mostly were men, who migrated from China to Taiwan were not educated folks. Taiwan was very much a rough and tumble place, far from the centers of power and culture. Taiwan didn't really start producing literature until the very end of the Qing Empire's control over the region. And then, and this is important, as Taiwan was looking to almost get ready to start contributing literature significantly, at that point, the Qing lost control of the island. That's in 1895, the Japanese took over the island, which reset the clock on literature coming out of Taiwan. Suddenly, the powers that be spoke not Chinese, but Japanese. Almost all Taiwanese folk spoke a Chinese language, usually Taiwanese or Hakka, and then obviously you have the indigenous population that is speaking a variety of non-Chinese languages. So what happens? The Japanese take control in 1895 and they create Taiwan as a colony. They set up an education system and it's meant to channel the best and brightest into learning Japanese. The figures who did best essentially had to learn a new language. The people who would become writers had to learn Japanese if they wanted to publish in the language of people that mattered. The decision makers, the people who were at the highest rung of society, all spoke Japanese, and most were native Japanese speakers. That is, most had come from Japan, the metropole, and had migrated to Taiwan just to be colonial officials. And that's why it's not until 1920 when we see the reemergence of a literature on Taiwan. It took a generation of Taiwanese folks being educated in Japanese for folks on Taiwan to really get to the point where they could write in the imperial language. For those of y'all who don't know, Japanese is completely unrelated to Chinese. Yes, they do share Hanzi, the Chinese characters, but in terms of grammar and structure and things like that, they are completely different language families. Japanese may actually be related to Turkish and Finnish. There's actually still some debate, I believe, amongst linguists, but it's fair to say that Japanese is more like Finnish than it is like Chinese. So it takes a generation of Taiwanese folks getting educated in Japanese for them to really have a crop of writers. That crop comes to harvest in 1920. The Taiwanese literary historian Ye Shitao divides the literature in Taiwan under the Japanese into three stages. 1920 to 1925, that's kind of the incipient stage. Things are just getting started. 1926 to 1937, that's the stage of maturity. And then 1938 to 1945, those are the war years. A couple of points about this. Ye says, hey, Taiwanese literature does not really get started until 1920. Again, there is this question of acculturation, particularly acculturation to a language that's not native to Taiwan. Very few people in Taiwan, even in 1920, speak Japanese as their mother tongue. The rest are being educated in that language if they're making it to the highest tiers of education. There is this very much a question of acculturation, having to inculcate Japanese language skills into the Taiwanese population. Second, the period where pre-1945 Taiwan literature reaches its apex is that period from 1926 to 1937. It's not the latter period, not the literature of the war years. During this period, the war years, Japanese imperial forces came down really hard on literary figures and actually in the wider Taiwanese cultural world. There was a very strong assimilationist push, so they wanted to essentially turn Taiwanese folks into Japanese people. They encouraged them quite strongly sometimes to get rid of their Chinese names and adopt Japanese names. They encouraged them to stop speaking Chinese, whether it be Hakka, Taiwanese, whatever version of Chinese they spoke at the home. Literary figures during the period from 1938 to 1945 were forced to produce stories that were really propaganda for the Japanese empire. Lots of stories were forced, not very good. They were talking about how Taiwanese people were adopting Japanese cultures, Japanese names, Japanese tradition, becoming Japanese. You can imagine stories about those kinds of things are not very fun. And they're also not very good literature. A novel that we're doing in another podcast called The Orphan of Asia actually has some discussion of this. It's a work that talks about the process of this Japaneseification. So what we need to keep in mind is from 1926 to 1937, this is the high point of literature coming out of Taiwan in that pre-1945 period. Really, you're not going to have that much great literature coming out of Taiwan until 1960. So 1926 to 1937 is kind of the high point in Taiwan's first century of having literary presence. Lai He's rise as a writer really marks the beginning of that high point. Lai He has been called the father of Taiwan's new literature. That new literature here, it's referring to the Taiwanese writers in that period coming after 1920. Lai He is born in 1894, just before the Japanese take over Taiwan. He's born in Jianghua in central Taiwan. He dies in 1943, just before the Japanese are about to lose the war. He was thrown in jail because of his support for the Taiwanese over the imperialist Japanese. And it's not actually clear why he died. I've read from different sources, different things, but my impression is that he died because he was denied medical care by the Japanese as he was in jail. Lai He is going to become one of the most important writers of Taiwan literature. During his brief life, he was educated first in the old Chinese style, using Confucian texts. This is the education similar to the style of education that many up-and-coming figures in Chinese history had received since the Song dynasty, that is, for the last millennium. Once he gets into middle school, his education completely shifts. He goes from being educated in this Confucian mode to being educated in the modern Japanese education system. Lai He was apparently quite smart. In 1909, at the age of 16, he tested into Taiwan's top medical school, the Taiwan Governor's Medical School. After becoming a doctor, he actually moved from Taiwan to China. He set up a doctor's office in Xiamen. He was a very popular doctor there. Xiamen is an interesting place from the Taiwanese perspective. Xiamen is a part of China. Taiwan is a part of the Japanese Empire. So they're politically completely different. But the ancestors of much of the population of Taiwan had migrated from China to Taiwan through the area around Xiamen. Remember what I said before, Taiwan was colonized by the Han Chinese starting really in the 1600s. A lot of those Han Chinese colonists are coming to Taiwan from the area around Xiamen, which means the language of Taiwanese is basically the same thing as the language that's spoken in Xiamen. They're very similar. So Xiamen is a place where a Taiwanese person can go and without too much trouble slip into Chinese society. While Lai He is in Xiamen, he internalizes some of the political changes that are occurring in China. In Taiwan, people are not particularly keyed into the changes happening in China. Tokyo is the capital of the empire. that they are in. What is happening in Tokyo is much more important to the average Joe on the streets in Taiwan compared with what is happening in Beijing. But because of Lai He's fairly unique experience in Xiamen, Lai He understood much of what was happening in China at the time. You might ask, what was happening in China at that time? In 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed, ending 2 millennia of imperial rule. In 1919, there's a massive debate in China, starting out on the streets of Beijing, particularly around Beijing University. The debate is called the May 4th movement, which, surprise, surprise, happens on May 4th, 1919. There are lots of debates that happened during the May 4th movement. You have discussions of gender and the oppression of women, discussions of government. I'm not going to get into all of those. The thing that is most relevant to us is literature. The most important figure you need to know about from the May 4th movement, at least for this podcast, is Lu Xun, one of the most famous Chinese writers in the 20th century. Lu Xun publishes a series of stories starting in 1919. These are the first stories that are intentionally written in contemporary vernacular rather than classical Chinese, the language in which most writing had been done for nearly a millennia. With Lu Xun's stories becoming famous for being written in contemporary vernacular Chinese, the floodgates really open, and people in China are rapidly abandoning the cherished classical Chinese language and starting to publish in this new modern vernacular language. Lai He is in Xiamen when all this goes down, and when he returns to Taiwan, he brings this thinking about getting away from classical Chinese and turning towards modern vernacular. Remember, Lai He started out his education being educated in the Confucian classics, which are all written in classical Chinese. So he's very aware of the linguistic context that these changes are happening in. And when Lai He puts his pen to paper, he shifts from writing mostly in classical Chinese to writing mostly vernacular Chinese, which is an innovation for the time. It's hard to think going from a dead language to what people speak on a day-to-day basis. That's an innovation, but it was an innovation at the time. Also, Lai He is eventually going to experiment with writing not in a sort of standard Mandarin-like Chinese. He's going to experiment in writing in Taiwanese, which is a language that does not have a long written tradition connected to it. What did Lai He write about? The subject of his works mostly focused on 3 topics. First, how oppressive the Japanese imperial forces could be when dealing with the Taiwanese. Second, how poor Taiwanese folks were getting shafted. And that brings us to today's story, the story we're going to look at for today's podcast. The story is called A Lever's Scale. It's written in 1926 and published in the Taiwan People's News on February 14th and February 21st. So it's serialized over 2 separate issues. You can find a translation of this in Taiwanese Literary Reader, published by Cambria Press. Let me briefly introduce the plot of the story, and then we'll discuss some of the broader issues. The story takes place in a village in Taiwan. A man, his last name is Qin. He's a sharecropper. He dies, leaving a widow and an orphan son. That orphan son's name is Qin Chit-cham. In this story, the mother of Qin gets remarried, and the stepdad treats Qin really badly. Then there's an economic crisis. At every turn in the story, early in the story, the sugar company is some sort of monopsony. It's a single buyer in a market with lots of sellers. They're buying sugar from the farmers. The farmers have no choice as to who they sell their sugar to. And so the sugar company forces the farmers to sell them sugar at a low price. So what do the farmers do? They stop growing sugar. But when the company raises the amount of rice that farmers have to provide, which it's not clearly explained, the company raises the amount of rice that farmers have to provide, so landowners end up taking that price and raising the amount that their sharecroppers have to provide them, thus charging them higher prices for land use, essentially. So Chen becomes an adult in a world that's economically quite cruel. He has a stepfather who hates him. He's buffeted economically. Things just keep piling up. He has a son, and his mother dies. His wife then again has a daughter, so they have 2 children. Qin is having to work very hard because his wife with 2 kids is not able to work. While working, Qin gets hurt. He goes to the doctor of Western medicine. He gets charged an arm and a leg, and it does not really heal Qin. Again, the text implies that somehow the Western medicine doctor exploited Qin, though it does not say exactly how. While Qin is hurt, he stays at home, the kids crying alongside him, and that's not a metaphor. The text explicitly states that the 3 of them are crying together, moaning in pain. This means that the wife, whose name is never mentioned, we're not even told that they got married. She just kind of appears. So the wife has to go out and work. Again, there is this sense of economic oppression. The family is struggling. Qin hears that he can make good money selling vegetables in the market. He gets a loan from his sister-in-law by pawning her golden hairpin. He goes and makes lots of money selling vegetables. At this point in the story, things start looking up. Qin starts thinking about all the things he's going to buy now that he has money from selling vegetables in the market. He's thinking about getting his kids new clothes, buying back that hairpin that he sold to the pawn shop in order to finance his vegetable selling business. Then a Japanese policeman comes into the market, begins harassing Qin. He insults Qin by calling him a beast. That's a curse in Japanese. He reports Qin to the authorities, tries to make some sort of tax claim against him. Qin is forced to either pay money to make up for those taxes or go to jail. Qin feels that this treatment is unjust, but his wife pays the fine just to get him out of jail. After this event, Qin feels unmanned. He feels like he's been bestialized. In his thoughts, he repeats the word that the Japanese police officer insulted him with: beast, beast, beast. Here's a quote from the story. This is my translation, not the translation in the book. People are not treated as if they were individuals, but rather beast. Who is willing to take it? What kind of world is this? Perhaps I would be happier dead rather than alive. And then on New Year's Day in 1926, the neighbors of Qin hear a disturbing sound. The text implies that the night before, Qin has gone and murdered the Japanese policeman who harassed him. And then on New Year's Day, he goes and commits suicide. And that's the quite sad ending to the story. Okay, I want to unpack this story a bit. First off, this touches on 2 of the main themes that run throughout Lai He's work. First, the story is about the poor being oppressed. Second, this is about Japanese imperial forces oppressing the Taiwanese. Both of those are pretty clear from my summation of the story. One thing that might not have been clear, this story is published on February 14th and February 21st, 1926. In 1926, Chinese New Year occurred on February 13th. When he dies, Qin is the exact age of Japanese imperial control over Taiwan. Japan took over Taiwan in 1895. That's when Qin is born. Qin's life has become a metaphor for all the Taiwanese folks under Japanese rule, which, if this is the life that the Taiwanese have led under Japanese rule, that means the Japanese rule has become quite oppressive. So you can see his use of literary symbolism makes it clear that Lai He is worthy of the title of the father of new Taiwan literature. He has very much a social justice platform that is relevant to the time that he is writing. He also was a literary figure who became one of the most famous early on. In 1926, with stories like this, becomes a leader of Taiwan's literary world. And he nurtures many young Taiwanese writers. I also want to turn a critical eye to this story. I think this story represents the apex of literature coming out of Taiwan in this Japanese colonial period. Like Ye Shitao said, 1926 is the beginning of the period of maturity for the literature of Taiwan. Lai He is pointed to as the embodiment of that maturity. But I'll have to say, reading this as a modern 21st century reader, from a narrative perspective, the story lacked something in maturity. It just feels like there's some major narrative jumps. There's a lack of smoothness. Taiwan literature is still a budding literature at this time. It's still developing. Just as an example, during the story, we're all of a sudden told that Qin's mother got a grandson. The story doesn't tell us that Qin was married. Initially, it's not even clear that Qin had a son. At first, when I read it, I thought, did Qin have some sort of brother or sister who just comes out of the blue? No, in fact, what the narrative says is just grandma had a grandson or something like that. But what it means is that Qin had gotten married, that's not mentioned, and Qin had just had a son with his wife. In the ending, we're never told that Qin kills himself or that he killed the Japanese police officer. That is implied by the story, but the way the narrative presents it is a very lacking in smoothness. I think that the story is lacking in the construction of narrative arcs. The characters feel a bit two-dimensional, like they are boldly meant to be symbols by the author. None of that's to say that this story is not worth reading. I think it is worth reading, but it is to say that when you, as a modern 21st century reader, come to this story, you have to massage your expectations a bit. The culture of fiction writing in Taiwan is very rudimentary at this point. This is still a developing tradition of fiction writing, which makes sense considering where this story occurs in Taiwan's literary history, as I discussed earlier in the podcast. That's something that marks all of the writing from this period in Taiwanese history. We'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the novel Orphan of Asia. I'll save that for another podcast. Lai He's of is about different forms of oppression of the poor, oppression of the colonial Taiwanese subjects. This story is one of the stories for which he became famous. It touches on both of these topics. I think that's a good place to end it. Until next time, my name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island. Until next time, I'll sign off by saying thank you for listening in Taiwanese. 多谢